The desert stretched endlessly beyond the horizon, a landscape of dust, rocks, and stubborn shrubs under a merciless sun. Morgan Steele stood on the porch of Rancho del Lobo, arms crossed, scanning the terrain with sharp eyes trained by years of survival in the world's most hostile war zones. The ranch was a sanctuary, a hard-earned refuge from the ghosts of her past. But tonight, she sensed a storm brewing, not of wind and sand, but of men and violence. Behind her, Michael Carter finished securing the last of their perimeter defenses. He moved with the precision of someone who had spent years in the CIA, his mind always 3 steps ahead of any possible threat. "You saw them again?" he asked, his voice even but edged with concern. Morgan nodded. "Black SUVs. Same route. Same pattern. They aren't lost, tourists." Michael exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Cartel scouts. Maybe." Morgan wasn't one for speculation. She dealt with facts. And the facts were troubling. Disturbed fence lines, footprints appearing in the dust where no one should have been, and now, the vehicles. They both knew what it meant. The land they called home wasn't just a ranch. It was a critical passage for those looking to move illicit cargo, drugs, weapons, or worse, across the U.S.-Mexico border. And someone had decided they wanted it. Morgan's grip tightened on the sidearm holstered at her hip. She had no intention of handing it over. The following afternoon, the first real move was made. 3 SUVs rumbled up the dusty driveway, stopping just short of the main house. The men who stepped out were dressed too cleanly for ranchers, their demeanor too practiced for mere businessmen. Their leader, a tall man with sharp features and a deliberate, confident stride, removed his sunglasses as he approached. "Morgan Steele," he said smoothly. "I've heard a lot about you." Morgan remained motionless, eyes unreadable. "I'm sure." The man smirked as if entertained by her lack of reaction. "Javier Ruiz," he introduced himself, extending a hand that Morgan didn't take. Unbothered, he withdrew it and continued. "You own a valuable piece of land. I'd like to buy it." "No sale." Javier chuckled. "You haven't even heard my offer." He snapped his fingers, and one of his men popped open a briefcase, revealing stacks of neatly bound $100 bills. $2 million. Cash. Michael stepped forward then, positioning himself slightly between Morgan and the cartel leader. "Like she said, no sale." Javier smiled dimmed slightly. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound ominous. "I'd think carefully. People who refuse me tend to regret it." Morgan tilted her head, sizing him up. "People who threaten me tend to regret it faster." Silence hung heavy between them. Javier studied her, considering whether to push further. Then, with a small, amused nod, he gestured for his men to close the briefcase. "I admire stubbornness. Let's hope it doesn't get you killed." As the SUVs roared away, kicking up clouds of dust, Michael turned to Morgan. "This isn't over." Morgan watched the vehicles disappear over the horizon. "No, it's just starting." The first attack came 3 nights later. Morgan was in the security room, monitoring the ranch's infrared cameras, when the alarms tripped. Movement, multiple figures advancing from the southern perimeter. She was on her feet instantly. "We've got company." Michael was already moving, grabbing his rifle and switching off the safety. "How many?" "Too many for it to be casual." They moved with silent efficiency, slipping into the shadows of the barn and surrounding structures. The attackers were well-trained and methodical in their approach, cartel foot soldiers, but with the discipline of professionals. Morgan waited until they were inside the perimeter before she acted. A single shot rang out from her suppressed rifle, and the lead intruder crumpled. Panic rippled through the group as Michael picked off another from a concealed position. Within seconds, the ranch became a battlefield. The cartel had come to intimidate. Instead, they found resistance they hadn't expected. By the time the last of them retreated into the darkness, leaving their wounded behind, Morgan knew they had sent a message of their own. This was their land, and they weren't giving it up. By dawn, the ranch was eerily quiet. The bodies of the cartel operatives who hadn't escaped lay sprawled near the southern fence line, while the injured ones moaned weakly under the weight of their wounds. Michael wiped blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. "They'll come back." Morgan crouched beside one of the wounded men, pressing the barrel of her pistol against his chest. "Who sent you?" The man coughed. blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. You know who. Javier. Michael exhaled sharply. Then we need to hit first. Morgan stood, eyes cold. We sent a message. Loud and clear. An hour later, the bodies of the fallen were delivered to Javier Ruiz's estate and dumped unceremoniously at the front gate. Attached to one of them was a note. Stay out of Rancho del Lobo. Javier Ruiz was not a man to take defiance lightly. Less than 24 hours after Morgan's warning, the cartel's response came swift and brutal. A firebombing attack on a nearby ranch, one owned by a friend of Morgan's, left the buildings in ruins and 3 innocent people dead. Morgan clenched her fists as she stood among the charred wreckage. The smell of smoke and burnt wood filled the air, mingling with something worse, the acrid stench of blood spilled in the dirt. Michael knelt near the wreckage, sifting through the ashes. This wasn't just a warning. They're escalating. Morgan exhaled sharply. Then we hit them harder. Michael met her gaze. We can't take on an entire cartel alone. Morgan's jaw tightened. We won't have to. I know people. Morgan made 3 calls. The first was to Jack Callahan, a former Marine sniper who had walked away from the military only to find himself pulled back into the fight time and time again. You in? She asked. Jack didn't hesitate. Always. The second call was to Elena Vasquez, an ex-FBI agent turned ghost. The kind of operative who disappeared off the books when she decided the system was beyond saving. I owe you one, Elena said. Looks like I'm about to pay it back. The third and final call was to Daniel Bishop, a man so deep in the underworld that even the cartel feared him. If Javier's making moves this reckless, he's getting desperate. That makes him dangerous, Bishop mused. I'll be there. By the end of the night, the team was assembled. It was time to go on the offensive. The first target was one of Javier's main money laundering operations, a high-end nightclub in the heart of Juarez. It was a fortress in its own right, but Morgan and her team weren't planning on walking through the front door. Jack set up on a rooftop across the street, rifle ready. 2 guards at the entrance, another 4 inside. Cameras covering every angle. Morgan and Elena moved through the alley, slipping past security unnoticed. A side door gave them access to the back rooms, where cartel accountants worked behind locked doors. Elena picked the lock within seconds, and Morgan moved in, a silencer already attached to her pistol. 2 shots, 2 bodies dropped. Morgan grabbed a laptop from the desk, tossing it into her bag. Let's make this hurt. Meanwhile, outside, Bishop created a distraction. 2 well-placed car bombs sent cartel enforcers scrambling. In the chaos, Jack took his shots, eliminating key targets before disappearing into the night. By the time the dust settled, the nightclub was in ruins, its financial records erased, and its security team obliterated. The message was clear. Javier had started this war. Morgan was going to finish it. Javier Ruiz sat in the dimly lit confines of his private estate, the heavy scent of cigar smoke thick in the air. The reports from Juarez were worse than he had anticipated. The nightclub was gone, his money launderers dead, and his operations crippled overnight. He crushed the cigar between his fingers, letting the embers smolder before flicking it into an ashtray. Morgan Steele, he muttered, barely suppressing his rage. You think you can walk into my city and do this? Across from him, a man in a dark suit shifted uncomfortably. Sir, we've confirmed that Steele's team was responsible. The sniper, Callahan, took out our security before anyone knew what was happening. Vasquez and Steele were inside before we could react. And Bishop, well, he made sure there was nothing left to recover. Javier exhaled slowly. Then we retaliate. We take the fight to her doorstep. He turned to a figure standing in the shadows, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar running across his temple. I want Steele dead. I want her people dead. I want that ranch burned to the ground. The man nodded, his voice like gravel. Consider it done. Back at Rancho del Lobo, Morgan sat at the kitchen table, dismantling her rifle with methodical precision. The silence between her and Michael was heavy with unspoken words. You know what happens next, Michael finally said. Morgan didn't look up. They come for us. He nodded. Javier isn't going to let this go. Morgan snapped a fresh magazine into place and set the rifle aside. Then we don't wait. We get ready. Outside, Jack and Elena reinforced the perimeter, setting up additional motion sensors and tripwires. Bishop checked the supply cache, making sure they had enough ammunition for what was coming. Then, the first alert went off. Jack's voice came through the comms. "We've got movement. 3 vehicles approaching fast." Morgan grabbed her rifle. Everyone in position. The battle for Rancho del Lobo was about to begin. The first explosion rocked the front gate as the convoy of SUVs tore through the dirt road leading to the ranch. Gunfire erupted as Javier's men opened fire, bullets ripping into the wooden fences and structures. Jack picked off the driver of the lead SUV from his rooftop position, sending the vehicle crashing into a ditch. Elena moved like a ghost through the shadows, eliminating attackers before they could breach the main house. Morgan and Michael took the fight head-on, returning fire from behind sandbags and barricades they had set up in preparation. The cartel was throwing everything they had at them, but Morgan's team had the advantage. They knew the terrain, and they had trained for this moment. Bishop, ever the wild card, launched an ambush from the rear, flanking Javier's men and cutting through their ranks with brutal efficiency. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes, but by the time it was over, the ground was littered with bodies, and the remaining cartel enforcers were either dead or fleeing into the night. Morgan stood over the wreckage, rifle still smoking. That was just the opening move. Michael nodded grimly. "Javier won't stop until one of us is dead." Morgan exhaled. "Then we finish this. We take the fight to him." Javier Ruiz wasn't a man who accepted defeat. The attack on Rancho del Lobo had failed, but he had more men, more weapons, and the kind of wealth that could buy loyalty with blood. Sitting in his office, he listened as his lieutenant listed the casualties. Too many. Too many for a ranch in the middle of nowhere. Morgan Steele was more than just a former soldier. She was a problem. "We underestimated her," his lieutenant said, eyes downcast. "We won't make that mistake again." Javier exhaled through his nose, eyes dark with fury. "No. This time, we don't just send men. We send a message." He leaned forward, lighting another cigar. "Find out where she's hiding the rest of her allies. Find her weak spots. And when you do, burn them." Morgan wasn't waiting for Javier's next move. She knew better than that. Sitting in the war room of the ranch, she studied a satellite map of Javier's known properties. "We need to hit him where it hurts. His money, his influence, his men." Jack leaned forward, tapping one of the locations. "This is his logistics hub. Guns, drugs, everything he moves goes through here. We take it out, we cripple him." Michael nodded. "High risk, high reward." Elena smirked. "I like those odds." That night, under the cover of darkness, they moved. The logistics hub was heavily guarded, but Morgan's team wasn't planning a full frontal assault. They moved like ghosts, cutting down guards silently and planting explosives at key locations. Just as they were about to leave, a convoy of reinforcements arrived. "Looks like we're staying for the fireworks," Bishop muttered. Morgan raised her detonator. "Light it up." The explosion rocked the compound, flames consuming everything in their path. Gunfire erupted, but Morgan and her team were already gone, slipping into the shadows. Javier would feel this one. When the news reached Javier, he didn't react at first. He simply sat there, inhaling deeply, letting the fury simmer beneath his skin. Then, in one swift motion, he grabbed his lieutenant by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "I told you to stop her." The man stammered, eyes wide with fear. She's unpredictable. She's not like the others." Javier released him with a shove, turning to the men gathered in the room. "She thinks she's a ghost. She thinks she can disappear. But everyone leaves a trail. Find it." He stepped forward, voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "And when you do, make sure she watches as everything she loves burns." Morgan knew Javier would come for her. The attack on his logistics hub was a blow he wouldn't let go unanswered. But she wasn't going to wait for him to strike first. Using Bishop's network of informants, they tracked Javier's movements. He had retreated to one of his private estates in the mountains of northern Mexico, heavily fortified, surrounded by elite mercenaries. He was preparing for war. "Then we give him one," Morgan said. They devised a plan, a multi-front assault, forcing Javier's men into a bottleneck, cutting off reinforcements, and ending the fight in one decisive strike. "We take him alive if we can," Michael said. "If not," Morgan finished his sentence. "We end this." The night sky was pitch black as Morgan, Jack, Elena, and Bishop approached the compound. Silent and deadly, they moved like shadows through the trees. Jack positioned himself on a nearby ridge, sniper rifle at the ready. Elena and Bishop set charges along the perimeter, ensuring no reinforcements could escape. Morgan led the breach team, slipping past the outer guards undetected. Then the signal came. Jack fired the first shot, taking out a rooftop sniper. Instantly, the compound erupted in chaos. Explosions rocked the entrance as Bishop detonated the charges. Morgan and Elena moved in fast, cutting through Javier's men with brutal efficiency. Gunfire filled the air, shouts of panic and pain echoing across the courtyard. Morgan moved toward the main house, knowing Javier would be waiting for her. She found him in his office, standing behind a massive desk, a pistol in his hand. But he wasn't aiming at her. Michael was on his knees, blood running down the side of his face. Javier smirked. "You thought you could just take me down? I always have a backup plan." Morgan's grip tightened on her rifle. "Let him go." Javier shook his head. "You cost me everything. My men, my business. You think I'm just going to walk away? You don't have to walk anywhere," she said coldly. Javier's finger twitched on the trigger. Morgan moved before he could fire. A single shot rang out, and Javier staggered back, his own gun slipping from his fingers. Michael lunged, knocking the weapon away. Javier gasped, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. He stumbled, his back hitting the wall. Morgan stood over him, gun still raised. "This is for everyone you've hurt," she said. Javier chuckled weakly, blood dripping from his lips. "You think this ends with me?" Morgan's eyes hardened. "No, but it's a damn good start." She pulled the trigger one last time. By dawn, the compound was nothing more than smoke and ashes. Javier's cartel was shattered, his men either dead or fleeing. Morgan stood at the edge of the wreckage, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Michael walked up beside her, bandaging his wound. "It's over." She exhaled. "For now." Jack and Elena approached. "Bishop's already cleaning up the loose ends. No one's coming after us." Morgan nodded. "Good. Then it's time to disappear." Michael frowned. "You sure? We could do some good with what we know." She looked at him, then at the horizon. "Maybe. But right now, I just want peace." Jack grinned. "You? Peace. I'll believe it when I see it." Morgan smirked. "Then don't look too hard." She turned, walking toward their escape route, her past finally behind her. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from something. She was running toward something new.